everyone, it's Simi Shaw, and welcome to Trailblazers. On this podcast, I dive deep into the journeys of trailblazing South Asians, sharing the stories of the leaders and dreamers lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to say a quick thank you to you all, our community, our listeners, our readers, wherever you find us. We had the privilege of hosting a live podcast just a few weeks ago, and it was really amazing to bring our community to life in this way. Some of you have been asking if we could come to your city or how you can hear about these events. As always, I will encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com. And of course, follow us on socials. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube at South Asian Trailblazers. And please feel free to get in touch with us on our website or across socials at any time. Can't wait to meet more of you real soon. And now, on to our episode. I could not be more excited to introduce you all to our trailblazer today, Medha Gargeya. Medha is Associate Counsel to the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and a reservist with the U.S. Air Force Judge Advocate General Corps, commonly known as JAG. At the White House, she helps manage ethics and oversight for the Vice President's office and works on policy areas ranging from criminal justice to voting and reproductive rights. She previously worked at the international law firm WilmerHale LLP, where she focused on administrative law, appeals, and anti-discrimination matters. Before joining the firm, Medha worked on voter protection for the Biden-Harris campaign in North Carolina, where she also helped with election litigation nationwide and on the judicial nominations team during the presidential transition. From 2019 to 2020, Medha was a law clerk to the Honorable Roger Wollman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, where she helped draft opinions and bench memos and prepare the judge for oral argument. In 2020, she also worked as an adjunct professor at the University of South Dakota School of Law, teaching art law, focusing on First Amendment copyright and trademark issues. She received her AB and JD from Harvard University, and she grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I am so excited to welcome Medha, who is a trailblazer in the field of law and has such a wide range of experience, which we're going to dig into today. Thanks for being here, Medha.
Simi, I'm thrilled. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So today you obviously serve as Associate Counsel to the Vice President of the United States, but your experience in law is quite expansive. You've worked in the Air Force to an international law firm, WilmerHale. Tell me about that inciting incident when you knew you wanted to be a lawyer.
Well, I think it was a gradual burn. So when I was really little, I wanted to be a ballerina and I was terrible at ballet. So that did not go anywhere. And so my parents, I think, were slowly thinking about ways to very subtly convince me that I was okay at other things. And so whenever we would get in arguments, which happened a lot when I was growing up, they would say, oh, you're really good at talking back. You're really good at arguing. So maybe you should consider being a lawyer. But if I'm considering it more deeply, it was probably more than that, right? So my great-grandfather on my mom's side, my grandfather's dad, was a public defender in India. And so I used to visit India every other year. Yeah, and I would grow up hearing these stories from my grandfather about his dad and about his clients and how some of them were accused of really, really scary things, murder, very intense, violent crimes, but his commitment to thinking that everyone deserves representation, that due process is important. And this was back in a time in India where I'm sure you and our listeners can understand that there's so much stigma, right? Stigma across caste, stigma against language, stigma against different barriers. And to hear that someone whose DNA I shared had this ability, this magnanimity to look past all of that was inspirational. And then my parents were really, really involved in our community from a young age. They always kind of tried to inculcate an interest in public service. We would always debate at the dining table. There were lots of conversations. And throughout our growing up, we had a couple of family friends who were lawyers. And I think I didn't really know about them, but I knew that people respected them. And I wanted that respect. I wanted that street cred where people could like come to me for some kind of help. And I didn't know what it looked like, of course. I had no idea like what an actual lawyer does. But I thought, oh, this is a person who people look up to. They think they're empowered in the community. So that's where it came from.
Wow. Now, there are obviously a lot of different paths in the world of public service. And it's honestly common knowledge that pursuing law is not an easy path. Law school tends to be pretty difficult. You have to take the bar exam. It's often associated with a lot of long hours, very difficult and involved work and intense work. Why specifically this field? I mean, you could have chosen to pursue public service through a variety of different pathways.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Simi. It's not easy. And I think that what drew me to it was the analytical rigor and maybe in some ways the attempt to be dispassionate about social issues that really do rile you up. I remember in school, in grade school even, we would learn about why we're supposed to stand up when we say the Pledge of Allegiance or Brown versus Board of Education. And those are all things that you feel very viscerally like, right? Or at least I do. But the idea that the law is something where you have to be very disciplined about your arguments, where there's a system, made me hope that I would be able to gain that analytical rigor and intellectual rigor. And so I think that's what drew me to it. And then I had really great professors in college who some of them were like joint appointments with the law school. And I just learned so much from them. I loved the lens in which they saw the world. And I think I just wanted to be like them. And that's what drew me.
Wow. I like that you described it specifically through the angle of being dispassionate. I think that's super interesting. And to your point, speaks to the analytical piece of using logic and the law to sort of advocate around these issues. In terms of your undergraduate experience, while you were at Harvard, and even right out of college, you spent time in internships that seemed to really expose you to the expansive legal universe, from the office of the clerk of the Supreme Court to shortly after college, Google's patent prosecution team. I think sometimes it's easy for us to forget that the legal field has a lot of range in terms of what people's careers can look like. How did you zero in on certain specialties and institutions? And how did these early experiences help shape that path?
Yeah. So in high school, I remember I had this goal of interning in all three branches of government because I didn't know what I wanted to do. So my dad is a professor.
Wow.
He is a professor of business administration. And so like typical South Asians, we would talk about college. We would talk about public service and politics and religion and culture. And so I think that slowly exposed me to, okay, there are three branches. They all work together. What does the president do? I very keenly remember all the inaugurations, like after age 6 or something, because we'd watch them on TV. And so I knew there was a president. I knew that there was someone swearing them in who was wearing a robe. I knew that was, I guess, a judge. And then I knew there were people who occupied the Capitol where it happened, and those were Congress people. And so I wanted to gain that experience. And so through those early experiences, learning about how each of the three branches shapes law and shapes policy and how they work together, I think is what got me on the trajectory towards interning at the Supreme Court. Because I knew there was a court and I just on a whim, I wrote. So if I could say anything, I really firmly believe in the ability of just a cold email, really just, praying, put it forward, hope that it manifests. So I sent a cold email to the clerk of the court and I was like, I'm 16. I really, really love the Supreme Court. I've read a bunch of books. Do you need any help?
Oh my gosh.
And see what happens from there. But when I was thinking about what to do after graduation, what to do for summers after that, I wanted to see law from different angles. I'd never worked at a company before. Then I spoke to some advisors in college from the career office, and they were saying that tech is the new big thing. And I know tech has been the big thing for many years now, but
not anymore, maybe.
Yeah, not anymore. TBD. But I was like, okay, I use Google. That's probably the company I use the most. So I should apply to Google.
Oh my gosh.
So very, very on the seat of my pants, but it was a real privilege to see what legal practice looks like inside a company. And strangely, I think at the White House, that's maybe a little more similar to the work that I do now. Not obviously not on the patent prosecution front, but in the general counseling front, where you feel like you have a very direct client. It's the people who you work among. It's your company. It's your office. And you're there to answer any questions that they have and make sure that you're minimizing legal risk and attention and being as thoughtful and deliberative about complying with different requirements, legal and some of them being softer, but just like from a public imaging and public relations standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in that there's a direct person that you're working with in this like broader entity that is the core of who you serve and work with day in, day out. I want to spend a second on this because I think it's so interesting that at such a young age, you decided that you wanted to work for all three branches of government. We'll get into obviously the specific experiences you've had across those three branches, but what have been the key takeaways across what are the shared experiences and what differs between the three in terms of the experiences you've had from a legal lens?
Yeah. So after, I guess, high school, I worked as a law fellow with the Senate Judiciary Committee for a summer, which was extremely fun. There, we were working on judicial nominations. Working now in the vice president's office, I work on ethics and oversight. That's, of course, in the executive branch. And then I was a law for a judge right after law school for Judge Wollman on the Eighth Circuit. I think the overwhelming takeaway for me, and I hope this doesn't sound too cliche, but I really firmly believe that everyone is trying to do a good job. These are all people who are public servants who have limited resources, limited time. Unlike at the firm, there's not a cadre of paralegals or administrative assistants who are there to assist. People are just sometimes making things up as they go, hoping that things go well. But that has been my overwhelming takeaway. In terms of skills built, I think communication is always key in making sure that people know why you're approaching problems from a certain way. And that's communication, not just within your office, but also outside. As you know, on the Hill, a lot of senators and Congress people are working together to pass legislation, working together on hearings and being very vocal and clear about what you're hoping to get as an end result of that makes it seem less like people are doing things just for the sake of grandstanding or making a statement or getting more publicity, that this could actually create good policy. And I think that I felt that probably most at the micro level when I was working on the Eighth Circuit for Judge Wollman. There, of course, it's an extremely tiny workplace. It's the judicial assistant, the judge, and there were 3 law clerks. And it was amazing because we were assigned different opinions. And every couple of days we'd have lunch together and talk about the cases we're working on, thinking about not just how to write good opinions, but thinking about what lower courts or how are lower courts going to use this guidance? How is this creating a clear rule of law?
Interesting.
Do people understand the obligations that they will be held under? Does this seem fair? And some of those feel very existential, and I don't know if I have a good answer for them, but some of them you can kind of concretize, right? By reading other opinions, by seeing what other judges are doing in similar situations and precedent.
I want to spend yet another second on this host of experiences you've had, because while you were at Harvard Law after college, you interned for the Department of Justice, you worked at a criminal justice appellate clinic, you were at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. How did these experiences continue to shape your approach to advocacy work over time? And what were some of the key learnings you took away with respect to what you wanted to do in the long term?
Yeah, my hope was, and I think this was kind of a guiding principle even in college, was to be able to see legal experiences from as many angles as possible. And I think maybe some of that was because I didn't grow up with a legal background, right? I mean, I did. My great-grandfather was a public defender, but I only knew him through stories. He passed away a couple of years before I was born. And so my hope was that I don't want to have this myopia where there's some glaring legal issue that I'm not able to spot. And so that was why I was trying to get as many concrete experiences as possible. I'll talk about 2 that you raised. One was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and one was at the Criminal Justice Appellate Clinic with the MacArthur Justice Center. Those 2 experiences were fascinating. So the U.S. Attorney's Office, there are several there are hundreds across the country, are focused on prosecuting federal crimes. In a lot of places, they can be in D.C., for example, because everything in D.C. is federal law. D.C. is not its own state. They could range from misdemeanors or very small range crimes, or they could be public corruption cases or, government ethics cases that have a much bigger macro implication and call into trust the entire system. But I wanted to see the criminal justice system both from the prosecutorial experience and the defense perspective. And the Criminal Justice Appellate Clinic gave me that opportunity to think about in which cases does prosecution seem like it was not the best option, or that law enforcement or lawyers or any group of people in the law, in the legal system generally, in the criminal justice system, should have done more due diligence, or were not really following up to the standard that we hold them to, that a reasonable person would expect. And it gives me so much respect for people who are working on both sides of that aisle. And we can talk about this later, but what I really love about the JAG Corps is that prosecutors and defense attorneys are coming from the same ilk. So it's not like you're trained in a separate system. Sometimes the best prosecutors move to the defense team for their next assignment. Sometimes defense attorneys become chief prosecutors. And the hope is that you're building a more just system. My hope was that I would be able to communicate better on both sides, whichever side I work on. And in the civil space, with Protect Democracy and some of my other clinical and research experiences, I was working on separation of powers and constitutional issues, voting rights. And I think that too was just animated with the hope that I'll get as many experiences as possible. And I think being able to answer to the moment. When I started law school, this was when there was more attention about Black Lives Matter. There was a lot going on in the Trump administration that was raising questions about the powers of the executive, the powers of state governments, state attorneys general, state governors, and thinking about the rule of law more broadly. And so I wanted to think that I would be able to expose myself to these issues from the foremost legal practitioners to be able to think about the moment appropriately.
Interesting. And to that end, when you graduate from law school, you receive the very coveted opportunity to clerk for a judge, as you mentioned, Judge Wollman of the Eighth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. What was that experience like, and how did it shape your perspective on the judicial system broadly? As you said, it sounds like it was a very small team. You were opining on these opinions that would obviously set precedents for smaller courts. What was that like?
Yeah, I think it was an incredible experience. One of my favorite jobs ever. I think that it took a lot of the broad strokes that I learned in law school and really concretized it. So I listened to some commencement speaker once said the most important work is the work in front of you. And that's how you kind of feel as a clerk. You're given these opinions, you're given these assignments, these bench memos, these specific cases, and your job is to know the case in and out and to help brief the judge, to be able to follow oral argument, and to be able to come up with a reasonable opinion that people can follow and find useful and that is a just outcome in that case. And so even though you're perched above at a federal appellate level, you're really focused on trying to come to an outcome on one specific case or a couple of specific cases. It was a real privilege and a huge learning curve to look over hundreds of pages of records, a ton of briefings, and to be able to witness oral argument, I think was equally illustrative as just gaining those very hard skills of being able to navigate legal documents at that time. Because when you watch these oral arguments, these are really fantastic orators, and thinking about, well, if I were to ever argue, what types of skills, what type of tacks would I want to take, or what style would work for me, was something I really liked to try to pick up while I was listening to argument.
I'm curious, can you share some of the tacks that you did pick up and went about implementing in sort of your own practice?
Yeah. So I was reflecting more, and sorry, I'm going to take this at a much broader level. I was thinking about this Trailblazers podcast and about how each successive generation of South Asians have different privileges and approaches, right? And so I think with my parents' generation, it was just keeping your head down, hard work, let's do this. We'll try to make a name for ourselves. At least for my parents, it's let's try to contribute to society, not take away from anyone else. They felt this need to prove themselves. Then I look at people who, of course, I've listened to the podcast and elsewhere, who had to check all the boxes and do all the right things to get where they are.
Yep.
And I think now I feel this privilege that I'm able to be more authentic. I'm able to be silly. I'm able to let my guard down a little bit more. I think because of the validation that previous generations have created for us. And so the real trailblazers are my parents and the folks whose shoulders we're able to step upon. But when I think about this all with oral argument, the orators I enjoyed listening to the most are those who were very honest. So if there was a question that was posed that was outside the scope of their briefings or was outside the scope of, a very, very complex hypothetical, saying, I don't quite know how that would apply in this case, Your Honor, or I don't know how this would apply to the case at hand or how it would advance, the resolution in this case. I really respect that kind of honesty. And I think because of feeling that validation or feeling that support from prior generations, I would feel comfortable as saying something like that, as opposed to thinking that that's a mark of inferiority, or so I hope. Another thing I really enjoyed was just thinking about the parallels between teaching and lawyering, right? So I've heard a lot of people say that the best lawyers are those who are really great educators. So if you think about it, judges hear so many cases. And so when you come before them, sometimes they may need a refresher, or why is this important? Or what is actually at the heart of this? And so when you read really, really great briefs, sometimes it's just a story. It's look, this guy got hit by a train. It was in Minneapolis. this is what happened afterwards. Just making it, what is this actually about? And then thinking about how the law governs what happened. Because everyone can put themselves in the shoes of, okay, I was in Minneapolis, there's a train moving forward, but then making it this macro, like, what are the torts issues at play here? So those two things, I think a sense of honesty about how you're approaching the case. And the second is being very clear and being very thoughtful about the basics that you're working on.
Yeah. I love the part that you talked about trailblazers in each successive generation. We just did a live podcast with Anjula Acharya, and my parents actually joined for it. And at the end, I talked about how I think their generation absolutely are the original trailblazers. I mean, they laid the groundwork for what our generations are able to do and achieve today, especially with that level of comfort and authenticity that you're talking about that they didn't necessarily feel they had. So I love that. I find it so interesting, just given the range of experience that you've had and what you've been able to glean from it, and this idea of being a lawyer also being kind of like a storyteller, right? In that people often talk about how even in jury and trial cases, it's about who tells the better story, not always actually facts. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate you highlighting that piece. Now, after you spent time clerking for a year, you made a very incredible leap. You joined the Biden campaign, Biden for president, and you specifically went to focus on regional voter protection in your hometown, which is Greensboro, North Carolina. What inspired you to make that pivot?
Yeah, it was a pretty hard turn going from being very apolitical to hopping on a presidential campaign. But I felt really drawn to it. I think that summer, if you remember, Simi, it was summer 2020. It was around George Floyd's murder. There was a lot of attention to Ahmaud Arbery. And as a law clerk, I took my duty very seriously to be apolitical and not engage in protests or other activities that I thought could jeopardize the reputation of the court. But when I was finished with that, I thought about, I had a couple of months before I was going to start at the firm. The firm had pushed back my start date to January. And when I was in high school, I volunteered on the Obama campaign. And this is before I could vote. So really, it was just, and before I could drive. So I was in someone's backseat carrying a lot of signs. And it was quite the experience. But this time, I had a driver's license. I could vote, and I was voting in North Carolina. And I was drawn to voter protection because a lot of the work that I learned about in law school with Protect Democracy. I worked on a voter intimidation case where there was a pamphlet that was handed out that was essentially spewing fake voting requirements that people would have to show their naturalization forms and things like that to intimidate immigrants from voting. And so that was something really close to my heart. And I remember when my parents took their citizenship oath. I remember when my parents voted. I remember seeing my mom cast her vote. At that time in North Carolina, you could have children like near you, so it wasn't illegal or anything like that. But that's what made me, I just felt like I wanted to do something to work, especially on voting rights. And growing up in North Carolina, it's extremely diverse, right? There's a lot of Black people. There's a lot of Hispanic people. There's a burgeoning, at least for me, a very strong but fierce Asian community. And there's a lot of socioeconomic diversity. And what I loved about growing up in that area was that I grew up with friends of all kinds. I was one of three, I think, like left-leaning kids in fourth grade. I remember talking to my friends after Bush v. Gore and talking about the Supreme Court. Like we knew what we were actually talking. We knew nothing, but we were speaking very, very broad strokes. So I wanted to go back to North Carolina, and that's what I did. And I worked on micro and macro voting work. So on the micro level, thinking about when people vote, there's early voting, there's absentee voting, or mail-in voting, and then there's voting on election day. A big part of what we were trying to do was making sure that voting felt accessible and safe for people who were going. And this was also during the pandemic. And so there were so many restrictions. And I have so much respect for election workers. People were keeping places sanitized, had hand sanitizer everywhere, were really trying to do the best they could, having outdoor stations. It was really inspiring to see, but having poll observers in each of these polls to make sure that people felt safe voting and making sure that the polls were staying open for people who were still in line was a big part of my job. The second part was making sure that there was some type of legal recourse if something wasn't going right. So I remember working on this one case where a polling site was closed in a minority district, and it was the only polling site in a minority neighborhood in that entire county. And they just happened to close that one down. And so we sued. And they quickly reopened the poll, which was a great feeling. But we'll never get back those 36 hours of voting that didn't happen during the suit itself. So I feel really, really grateful to have been a part of that experience and to feel like I had the opportunity to go home and get to know, again, the community through silly recruitment calls or just listening to county board meetings. All of that was really, really meaningful. And then after that, I worked on election litigation across the country with some of the Democratic governors and their offices. And that was really inspiring too. And at that point, I'm sure you remember, there was so much litigation at such a fast clip about harvesting and stolen elections and things like that. And wrapping your head around the nuts and bolts of what was happening in each state and their election laws was an incredibly informative experience for me, and a great reminder of federalism as like this great American experiment.
Yeah. It's interesting because you just preempted my next question, but I was going to say, voter protection was a hugely relevant issue in the 2020 election. As we know, former President Trump's campaign tried to contest the election, claim voter fraud, all these things. You worked on a campaign back when you were in high school and couldn't even drive, to now you're a full-fledged lawyer. I mean, I'm curious, in what ways did your legal background inform your campaign work, specifically keeping in mind the turn that this election took?
Yeah, I think it was a real privilege to be in a position where you are checking that the systems are functioning. I didn't view my role as one where I'm advocating for a candidate, unlike when I was in high school, where I was just yelling random slogans and putting signs in people's yards who wanted them. That was a little different of a vibe. But this is one where you're making sure that people feel safe in the polling place. You're making sure that polls aren't closing. You're making sure that people know what the rules are, whether or not the signature has to match, whether like when they have to mail in their ballots. These are all things that I view as apolitical. They're about the system and making sure that the rules that were passed by the state legislature in North Carolina at the time, and still it's a Republican legislature, and the Board of Elections was democratically controlled, but, viewed themselves also as apolitical, making sure that those rules function. And even in my role now, that's what my job is, making sure that the Office of the Vice President and our components in the White House are functioning according to appropriate legal standards and rules, and making sure that everyone is aware of them and that we're able to minimize oversight risk. And so it's just making sure that folks understand and are able to play by the rules.
Yeah. Now, post-election, you are actually asked to join the Biden-Harris transition team. I mean, how did that come to pass? And can you explain what type of work goes into a presidential transition, specifically as an attorney in the general counsel's office?
Sure. So I know some of my friends who were a part of the transition even before the election was won. There's a kind of a headquarters that is formed where folks are thinking about who's going to fill high-level positions across different agencies. They're called agency review teams. There's also vetting for just general who's going to fill up government on day one. And this is, again, if I could, a plug on like why you should just do a cold email. After I was clerking, I didn't know I was going to get an offer from the Biden campaign in North Carolina. And so I reached out to a professor who I knew through Protect Democracy, the nonprofit, and said, "Do you need any help? I would love to help you. Like, I loved working with you. Do you need anything?" And he said, "Yeah, maybe, of course." But then when I got the Biden offer, he was like, "Oh, we're a nonprofit, so we're nonpartisan. It's not a good look to have you working on the campaign and a nonpartisan organization." I totally got it. But we stayed in touch. And so when the transition came about, I wrote to him and I said, "Look, the campaign's over. Do you need anything? I'd love to help Protect Democracy again. I got a couple of months to kill." And he said, "Well, actually, I'm a part of the transition now." So very cold email from an old professor.
Wow.
And that's how it happened. So I don't know how other presidential transitions work, but at least with the Biden campaign, it was very clear that they wanted to be as proper and buttoned up as possible about making sure that there weren't any conflicts, that people were very much in their lanes and had discrete projects. There was a separate email server. Everything was very, very protected. And during that time, I got in touch with the person who eventually became counsel to the vice president, who was my boss. And we were working on judicial nominations together, which was, after just finishing clerking, was amazing to think about, who are wonderful people we'd want to fill these Article 3 judgeships with. And I was working on vetting so many different people. And honestly, something a part of that was just thinking about like great characters in the law. Like, I got very lucky to just have to do a hardcore deep dive on so many people who now I really look up to and give me an example of what public service and maybe going between public and private sector look like. So it was externally also very gratifying for me, but that was how the transition worked. And when it came to inauguration, we kind of disbanded and the government continued, and the administration took everything that had been established in the transition and implemented it.
I want to double back on this conversation around judicial appointments because it's important to note that judicial appointments are a huge deal, right? I mean, they set so much up in terms of the stewards of the law in this country at these courts that I think oftentimes we tend to just place all that value on the Supreme Court without understanding that lower courts also make a huge difference. Can you talk a little bit about what that process entails?
Yeah. It's wild. There's so many levels to this, but essentially the White House counsel's office and there's an office in the Department of Justice, the Office of Legal Policy, work together on identifying folks for different open judgeships. And as you know, as you rightly said, there's so many lower courts. So there's hundreds of district courts across the country with different divisions. And then there's courts of appeals. And then there's, of course, the Supreme Court. There's the Court of Federal Circuit, which is a specialized, like intellectual property focused court. There's also non-Article 3 courts, like the Court of, CAF? I think the Armed Forces Appeals Court. I really should know this, but there's just a lot of judgeships. But what you're looking for, and I think at least my understanding, is folks who have a wealth of experience in working on different types of cases. And I think one thing that the Biden-Harris administration, or at least in my personal experience, is also looking for folks who would be great mentors or great representations of America. And when I talk about mentorship, it's particularly important because, as I'd mentioned before, your chambers are really small. Even at the district court level, there are 1 or 2 clerks, 2 or 3, max 4 really. And then there's a judicial assistant and the judge. And so you want to make sure that you're working with someone who is a great communicator, who wants to teach, who can imbue values, both personal and legal, to the person that they're working with. And I think there's a real sense of pride that you were trained under this person. And so I'm very grateful that there was this emphasis on not just the hard, like legal accomplishments, but also thinking of the person as like a representation of what good mentorship and what America can look like. And I think that's one of the primary successes, in my personal opinion, is like the diversity of judicial nominees from the administration.
Wow. Well, it sounds like an incredibly impactful role. And now you talked about how you worked in this role up through inauguration. And from my understanding, up to this point, you had also had the ability to defer this opportunity you had at the international law firm, WilmerHale. Was that always in the cards post-law school? Tell us a little bit about your work on anti-discrimination and government regulatory litigation at WilmerHale.
Sure. So I was a summer associate at Wilmer, and I'm sure a lot of folks know when you're in law school, typically the summer before your 3rd year, folks will go through like an on-campus recruiting process. And I had worked at Google, but I didn't know what a big law firm looked like. And again, with the hope of getting to know what different areas look like, I was like, okay, let me try this out. Let's see what happens. I'd always been interested in public service, but I thought, let's see how this feels. And the firm, I think, very much lived up to its reputation of nice and nerdy. I got so many mentors that summer that I just feel so lucky that I was a part of that community. And so I thought I would definitely want to go back after clerking. And so when I went back to the firm, I was obviously still kind of connected to Biden land. And I actually had the opportunity to join the administration very early on. But at that point, I had about 5 months of military training. I was very nervous to start this job working on judicial nominations, which is what I've been doing, and leaving, and then coming back and then leaving for training. And so I spoke to folks at the firm, and I was just blown away at how kind they were and how open they were about discussing this. A lot of them were very frank and said, Medha, if you want to go. This could be a great opportunity, and come back. Like, let's see when you want to come back and we'll figure it out. And I think I just felt so lucky that people were looking out for my career on a longer spectrum and not just thinking about how this would immediately inconvenience them, because it certainly would have if I immediately left. So that experience, I think, really cemented how great I felt about practicing there. In terms of the work itself, that was also really positive for me. So on the anti-discrimination front, I worked with partners in the New York office, the DC office, the Boston office, San Francisco office, advising universities, advising, like Fortune 500 companies and nonprofits on how to comply with Title IX, Title VII, Title VI, and different restrictions on discrimination. As you know, there's now a couple of big cases before the Supreme Court on university admissions and affirmative action, and thinking about that space being very turbulent and trying to advise companies on how to minimize legal risk in this environment over the next couple of years was extremely interesting for me. and also a real opportunity to grow and learn from senior associates and counsel and partners who had been in this space much, much longer than I had. On the government and regulatory litigation front, I worked a lot on administrative law. So as you know, a lot of rules aren't really passed through Congress, but are passed through administrative agencies and goes through a notice and comment rulemaking process. And those rules have huge impacts on industries. And so providing comments on what these regulations could mean for a certain company were all really interesting and fun for me. So what I really liked about being at the firm was just getting a range of different clients. And like I'd mentioned before, from huge companies to small nonprofits to universities.
Yeah.
And I got to work on one pro bono case, which was focused in North Carolina again on removing a Confederate monument in Alamance County, which had been the site of a lot of hurt in the African-American community there. And that was an incredible experience just to see how these arguments can be made and thinking about what other states had been doing on this front.
Now, I want to spend more time on the variety of issues that you've worked on over the course of your career, including interesting cases like this pro bono one you just mentioned. But you keep alluding to JAG, and I really want to talk about it because I think it's such a fascinating part of your career trajectory and just life journey. You are a reservist with the U.S. Air Force Judge Advocate General Corps. Can you talk about this program and what motivated you to serve?
Yeah, so my parents are super supportive of everything I do. But when I told them I wanted to join the military, they laughed in my face. They were like, Medha, what? As we told you before and why you became a lawyer, you backtalk, you're not good with authority, you argue a lot. Are you sure this is the right fit for you? But I remember hearing about the draft and selective service, and I have a younger brother and we're very, very close. And I remember thinking like, oh, if Manu, my brother, has to sign up, like, why can't I? Why is there a difference? Just because I'm a woman, that doesn't feel right. And so I went on my high horse and I was like, okay, maybe I'm going to apply to a military academy in high school. But then I came to the stark realization that I couldn't run a mile. I was not physically fit in the slightest. And so blew my chances at any service academy. Then I thought, okay, maybe I'll revisit this at some later point. When I clerked, my judge served on the U.S. Army, and we spoke a lot about his experience. And what I liked about it was that it was just so separate from the rest of his legal trajectory, that he did it for the sake of service. And it wasn't really about the outcome. You know, I don't think that he approached it from what skills am I going to get or how's this going to look good on my resume. He just did it. And of course, the draft was very much a thing then, but the idea that you just do something for the sake of service was really enticing to me. So I applied. I applied in fall of 2019. I wrote this essay about American values and my immigrant experience, and I got rejected. And I was very disappointed. I was like, guys, this is a really good essay.
Oh my gosh.
Then I spoke to my recruiter and he said, Medha, I think that a lot of folks are skeptical of people who don't have a military background. And I don't. Like, my folks have never served. Even in India, we don't really have much of a military background. And so I reapplied to kind of reaffirm my commitment that I was serious about this. And I got in, and super grateful. You go through like a medical process first to make sure that you're medically sound. You go through a lot of like, they'll make you walk on your knees to make sure like your spine is set. It's very, very strange. And I think it was kind of great to go into this totally blind because I had no idea what was expected of me. I just did it. And I faced another obstacle because my vision is pretty bad. And it's so bad, I didn't know until I went through this that I'm legally blind. And so I had to get this waiver from very, very high up. And so I was very nervous about not getting the waiver. But then finally the waiver came through. And it was still the pandemic. So I did commission. I swore and did my oath in May of 2020, but I only went to training in fall of 2021. And there are 2 rounds of training, at least for the Air Force and the JAG Corps. The first is officer training school, and the second is JAG school. And JAG school is very similar to law school, but it goes from 7:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And there's 30 minutes for lunch. So it's a lot of learning, but you make a lot of friends. And some of them are still some of my closest friends who have visited DC, and it's been great to see them. Officer training school is more similar to what you see in the media with the military. So it's a lot of yelling, a lot of marching, a lot of drilling. You are not allowed to ever go anywhere alone. You have to march everywhere you go. We woke up every morning at 4:30 a.m. and would sing the Air Force song and creed, and then do our physical training. And we would do it on the concrete. Wow. I remember thinking, there's certainly going to be a mat, but no, there was no mat. And I remember this one morning where I was having some kind of stomach cramps, and out of nowhere comes this general. And he's like, I don't see you lifting your legs high enough for flutter kicks. And I was like, my dude, my stomach hurts so much. There's no way I'm going to be able to lift my legs. But you do it. You kind of shut off your brain and you're like, all right, all my friends are doing this. We're going to do this together. And it was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life. I'm so grateful that I was able to do it. It really feels like a privilege.
Wow. This sounds like a very intensive experience. And to your point, you came in relatively blind. Were there any moments where you felt just completely defeated and weren't sure if you were going to make it through this training?
Yes. My partner, big sweetheart, had all my friends send in a couple of sentences of encouraging words. And so I had it in my pocket. And anytime things felt really bad, I would read through those. Another physical thing, at that point, I got better at running, but I have no upper body strength. And so I was really nervous about the push-ups. There was a requirement at the time to do 18 in a minute, which now doesn't seem terrible. But at the time, I'd never done one push-up. And so I was very, very nervous about the training. And so that, I think, was really scary for me because you can get kicked out if you don't meet the physical requirements, which makes sense, right? You want everyone to be deployment ready. That's the difference between being, I guess, someone in the military lawyer and being a regular lawyer, among other things. And there were other times where I definitely felt like there was a bit of a culture shock. I had this reputation. I think one of my friends said that you're like the granola side of the Air Force. And I was like, what does that mean? He's like, well, you're a vegetarian. And it's true. There was no food in the dining hall for me. So I would eat cereal. Then finally a salad bar opened. So I would eat some salad, but like the protein intake was zero. And so I was so nervous because I was like, I'm going to lose the muscles I carefully cultivated to do these push-ups. So I got permission to get like protein shakes. And also I think everyone has a different leadership style, right? And I think that in the military, a lot of folks who came from the enlisted side and were moving to the officer corps were very directive. And that was just not my vibe. And so I was nervous about how am I ever going to find my voice? How am I going to be capable of being a leader in this type of space? And when you're a lawyer in the military, you're not really a part of the core business, but you are there to provide authoritative legal advice. And so I was nervous about how would I ever be able to do that? And I kind of got thrown in the deep end because at the end of training, I was named like our squadron leader or whatever. And so there were 4 squadrons, each was like 80 to 100 people. And so they were all under my care and they would have to like salute me when I walked past, which made me extremely uncomfortable.
Wow.
I would have to like provide updates on where everyone was going and coming from to the majors and captains who were our instructors. And it was really, really amazing to feel like I was a part of this bigger whole. And yes, it was the case that I was maybe not as directive and didn't quite feel like I could be as loud, but there was a different type of leadership that I enjoyed. And that was one where everyone felt kind of empowered, where they felt open with me. They could be themselves. And that's what I really enjoyed.
Wow. Well, it sounds like an incredibly impactful experience. Can you give us a window into some of the types of cases you would see as a lawyer in the military?
Yeah, great question. So military law, at least the way it's taught, is in 3 different buckets. The first is what you probably saw in A Few Good Men, military justice. You can't handle the truth. This is like a court martial or some kind of hearing where someone is being disciplined for an action that happens on or off base service member. And the military justice system is very similar to our civilian justice system. There's a notion of due process. There is a court-appointed counsel, it's defense counsel, that is offered to you. And there's a lot of brief writing. There's a lot of arguing in court. There are military judges. So that's, I think, probably the most tangible. The second is civil law, and those are related to the operations of the base. So memorandums of understanding, MOUs with different contractors, or wills and trusts for service members, especially before people deploy. You want to make sure that they and their family know whatever expectations there are for future family planning and estate planning and things like that. Also, legal office hours, like legal aid office hours. So just helping direct people in the right direction of other resources. The Air Force and other military branches don't offer like divorce attorneys or things like that, but you can kind of point people in the right direction should they need it. And the last is operational law, which is international law, law of armed conflict, thinking about what are the guidelines and guardrails for engaging in interactions with other nations. And we learn all of those in JAG school. Right now at Langley Air Force Base, which is where I'm stationed, I work primarily on military justice and civil law. I was able to work a little bit on the base's drone policy, which is really fun in the operational law space.
Wow.
And similar to a lot of other legal practice, you kind of just dive in. You read the materials that you can get, try to look up similar cases, ask folks around you, and try to learn and approach the problem and be helpful.
Wow. You clearly have this passion for public service and advocacy and service at a broader level. And I want to talk about your role, of course, as Associate Counsel to Vice President Kamala Harris. But I think generally in this space, especially as it relates to politics and government and the military, there is a tendency, particularly in today's world, for people to get somewhat jaded and disillusioned when they become embedded within these institutions and systems. Have you experienced that? If you have, how have you continued to stay motivated about the work that you're doing?
That's such a good question, Simi. I think the reason I joined the military was because of this feeling like, why not? Like, why can't put aside my jadedness, put aside perhaps the higher callings of convenience? It would have just been easy to stay at the firm. And as my partner very sweetly said once, like, this could not have been more optional, Medha, when I was like trying to do push-up 2 and almost about to cry. He was like, Medha, you put yourself in this situation. But you do this because I think I just felt empowered. I think my parents just raised me with a sense of like, if you want to affect change, you should try it. Like, just do it. Who else will do it? And I feel lucky that I have a great support system. My family, my partner, my brother, my friends around me, that if I fail, okay, that's fine. I'll just keep trying on something else. And I hope that in mentoring, in being involved in different legal organizations, folks can feel like I'm a part of their community, that like they can always fall back to me. We can talk about it. We'll move on. And so there's a sense of, I guess, the Gandhian, like, be the change you want to see in the world. Just do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes you fall, but I feel very lucky that I've had the support system where I've never fell that much. I've never had like that rock bottom feeling yet. And that's probably a privilege. That is definitely a privilege.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's definitely relatable. And I think honestly serves as inspiration for all of us who I think sometimes need to be yanked out of our bubbles of things that feel like they matter, but probably don't in the grand scheme of things when we think about these broader opportunities we have to affect change on such a grand scale. To that end, today you serve the most powerful woman in the free world, Vice President Kamala Harris, as Associate Counsel. Can you talk about what your key responsibilities are and what a typical day for you looks like?
Sure, yeah. So I work on ethics and oversight, which is kind of like the internal office work. And then I also work on policy issues that come up day to day. There's so many things that we work on. Every day is different. I think it vacillates between feeling the momentousness of it. Like, yes, we are working for a historic, a trailblazing, fearless, fierce woman who has so many amazing ideas and wants to see them implemented. She travels and talks about what government can do for people, what policies we've enacted to make things and resources more accessible to the common American. And a part of that is making sure that she's briefed for all of those meetings. So when she travels, you want to make sure that you have a backgrounder on the state of the law in a place. So I focus on voting rights, criminal justice reform. That's obviously something of interest to the vice president as a former prosecutor. And of course, just with the state of play with the United States as it is now. And on reproductive rights, which is a big issue for her, and whatever else comes up. As you know, there's been a lot of talk about gun reform now with a series of mass shootings. And that's something that the office is also generally paying attention to. And so as the lawyers in the office, we feel as though we're able to look through statutes, look through legislative history and things like that to be able to understand what the law in a place is, to help think about which direction the needle needs to be or should be moved or considered more broadly. On the ethics and oversight work, and that's, I think, my main responsibilities. On ethics, it's making sure that, and I think I talked about this a little before, that the rules are clear and that people are able to follow them. And so it can be as silly as, Simi, before I did this podcast, I had to make sure that everyone was okay with it, that I was saying things that the office would feel comfortable with, that I was doing this in my personal capacity. And that happens for a lot of folks in our office, people going to different events, people having different speaking engagements. But then it's also at a more macro level, right? So thinking about financial disclosures, that of course is now very big in the news. making sure that the vice president, the presidents, and our commissioned officers are able to provide the by law required information about their income and outside activities and gifts and things like that. On the oversight front, as you know, we are now in a divided government with Republicans controlling Congress and Democrats in the Senate. And so there are more congressional hearings investigating some of the policies that the administration has implemented earlier. As a part of that, there are different requests for information. And so I help with managing some of that information. There's also FOIA requests, and FOIA is Freedom of Information Act. People can request information from the government. The Office of the Vice President and other components within the Executive Office of the President are not FOIA-able. That is to protect executive deliberations and the employees to make sure that they have, a free flow of speech. But the minute we write to someone in an agency, it's FOIA-able. So agencies are FOIA-able. And I work on these FOIA requests. And I think that a lot of people find FOIA requests very tedious. Any lawyers listening, I think, might feel that way. But I really like it because I think that this is how people know about the functioning of government. So yes, it's a pain. And we talk about redacting certain words in a sentence or entire emails. Do we want to have the name of the person, or we just redact the email? Do we redact the username and not the @government address that it is? But all that is important. This is how people know about government. And that's also how we're held accountable. So it's litigation like that, yes, can feel difficult and sometimes like a halt to progress, but it's the system that we signed up for, the checks and balances that we signed up for.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to hear you speak about this role. And again, the passion is so evident. I imagine the 16-year-old version of you that was cold emailing the Supreme Court didn't quite envision that you would be working for the Vice President of the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in this role and, how your perspective has shifted with respect to what you see the longer arc of your legal career looking like?
I truly would have been baffled. Honestly, I didn't know. I was like, I hope I get into a good college. Maybe one day I'll learn how to run a mile. It's just such low base expectations. But I ended up in this role. I think, again, another plug to the cold email or just staying in touch with people. My boss during the transition, Josh Shu, was an incredible mentor, incredible person. He and I stayed in touch. We talked about roles in government. We talked about my time at the firm. And when he had an opening in his office, he reached out and said, I have this associate counsel opening. Are you interested? And I was like, what? And I think I was at a Rumble class and I saw my phone and I totally lost my mind. I mean, I was like, do I need to exit the class right now? I'm losing it. But I had 4 more rounds of boxing. And I was like, okay, I'll just box and put out some energy and get out. But I had an interview.
I love that.
Yeah, it was so chaotic. But I guess you never know, right? And I, at that point, was also considering a couple of roles at DOJ, but just thinking about this historic principle, I don't know if I would. I knew who Kamala Harris was, but I did not know that she would be the person that she became. And I think she talks a lot about being the first, but not being the last. And I feel extremely grateful that I finally feel like I can be in this position to help people be able to do public service and feel like I can be a mentor. And maybe the thing that I didn't really anticipate was, and maybe what's guided my future career, is just the importance of following good people and keeping good people in your life and updating them. And sometimes the updates are trivial, like, oh, I read this interesting article that you might find interesting, or just, I'm thinking of you. But it's the relationships that I hope guide whatever future job opportunities there are.
No, absolutely. To your point, Kamala Harris is the first and certainly not the last. She's the first Black and South Asian woman to hold this office. What has it been like working for one of the most powerful women in this country, and that too, a woman of South Asian descent?
It is just simply incredible. I think sometimes when the going gets tough on a certain day, I just try to go back. And we have these things in the office called jumbos in the West Wing and in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. Every staff member can basically pick a photo that is blown up, this big gold frame to have in their office. And mine is from the inauguration day with the president, the first lady, the vice president, and the second gentleman, all in their masks on the steps of the Capitol on inauguration day. And I think about why, I would have never known that there would be a picture like that out there with someone like her up on those steps in such a position. She's trailblazing. And there are lots of things about her that I think we all want to implement in the office, right? The leader sets the tone. She is extremely diligent and rigorous about the information that she consumes. And it makes me want to be a better lawyer and be a more sharp thinker to think about issues in the office and policy issues. So that certainly has been amazing. And the office itself is extremely diverse. We have so many women of color, just like her. In fact, at one point, the office, our legal office was 3 South Asian women. I was like, this is a dream. Like, what else? Yeah, it was amazing. And I love that. I love that there is so much trust and a shared goal among everyone in the office. And I think as a lawyer for people around the office, I really try to approach legal problems when folks come to me as like you're coming with your best intentions. Like, let's try to figure this out. Even if it's a bit of a disaster, we can get through this together, and maintaining a cool and collected head through whatever storms we may face.
Can you, with respect to the storms that you may face, as you said when you were speaking about your core responsibilities and the issues that you're hyper-focused on today, whether it's around gun control or voting rights, can you talk about a particularly significant or impactful project that you've worked on?
Yeah. As it's become abundantly clear, I guess, I'm a rules girly. Like, I love rules. And something that is impactful to me, and I think does not disclose too much about, the functioning and projects of the office, is our ethics trainings. I know it's kind of boring, but I think they're really important for multiple reasons. One, because they set expectations of the standard in which public servants hold themselves. We are all following very specific guidelines. And I think there have been times where those rules have not been properly addressed or properly respected, and making sure that we rebuild faith in government. That is, I think, core to what this administration and what our work is about, making sure that people feel like public servants and the administration are trying to do the right thing. The other thing is considering the difference between political and official government activity. So this is something I didn't know too much about, but the Hatch Act is something that governs how federal government employees engage in politics. And so I can go to a political fundraiser, but I can't ask people to donate because I'm a White House employee. It comes with certain responsibilities. But on the other hand, some commissioned officers, so some of our speechwriters, for example, can write speeches for the DNC or things like that. And those rules are very, very complex, and sometimes they seem inconsistent. But I think that it's important for everyone to understand. And I know sometimes it can feel like thorn in people's foot, but those are important things. And that's, I think, what distinguishes us from not forms of government that are not as robust democracies. Sorry, it's not the sexiest answer.
No, but I think it's important for us to understand that it's not always the sexiest role, right? And what the day-to-day of that looks like. What has surprised you the most about your time as counsel to the vice president?
I think how quickly things come together. We are responding in real time to so many developments in the news, what are happening in governments across the world, and just the sheer deliberation time sometimes is not there. And so you want to make sure that there are really well-oiled processes to make sure that all the stakeholders who are trying to weigh in on responding to something very quickly are just naturally looped in. And the efficiency and trust that people have in each other in these really quick moments are so important. There's this Marine saying, I think, that slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And I swear, the first time I heard this, I was like, what? But now I kind of get it, because when there's smooth processes, when there's an idea that people know exactly what has to happen when a certain issue comes up, that's when we can respond quickly. And so I guess it was the pace of it for me. And when I was at the firm, I was primarily working on litigation. There's a very clear calendar, right? Your brief is due by X date. If that means 2 weeks out, we'll have the partners review. There's a very clear system. But here, it's just everything's in real time. I always have my work phone near me to see if there's anything coming up. But that's the office, right?
Yeah. I want to spend another second on that, because the political sphere is constantly changing, as is the court of public opinion. I mean, there is a new issue that becomes top of mind every day. How do you stay on top of that? And how does it shape your approach to work every day?
That's such a good question. That's actually the question I ask. We have some brown bag lunches. It's the question I ask of everyone because I want to get better practices on how to follow news and follow developments in my thinking about changes in the law. I have a little tab on my Chrome or whatever that's just like news, and I alternate among the different sources. And I try to read a range of different perspectives. So whenever I get a little distracted, I'll just click on New York Times. Okay, what's the new news of the day? I also follow Twitter. I try to follow people who are really thoughtful. And there's a lot of legal Twitter on cases and filings and things like that. And so that's really been a huge boon because I can't monitor all the filings as they come into different courts, but like there are folks who are doing this. And so that's been great to follow. Another thing is, at first I was like, this is wild, but like people keep the TV on. We have the TV on and kind of just watch stuff come in throughout the day. And there's a lot of push notifications and things like that. Sometimes it does feel like a little inundating, but I think you slowly start to learn to triage, like what are things that we actually have to respond to, like thinking about the vice president and her priorities. What are things that maybe they're not things that utilize the entire team's attention right now?
Yeah. What's been the most challenging part of this role?
I think with all roles, and especially with things moving as quickly as they do, the thing I've been so focused on is communication, ensuring that folks know when I'm working on something, or I have like a free 15 minutes. Do you need anything? Because things happen so quickly that like sometimes usually people will need something if you've got a free couple of minutes.
Yeah.
And also just finding out who works on stuff in the building. As you know, the Office of the Vice President is one component in the Executive Office of the President. There is also the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, the White House Counsel's Office, and we work closely with all of these parts. And so it's like a small p of politics. And one thing that I was really deliberate about doing after talking to a couple of friends before I took the role was just getting coffee with folks around the building, like 2 a week or something, just to see, okay, well, what do you do? If I have this problem, who should I reach out to? Or is there a counterpart working on this? Because the deliberation is so important, because especially when I came into this role, I had no background in the counseling work or ethics or oversight and some of these policy areas. And so talking to folks who know how the administration has worked on this before, the Office of the Vice President or on the President's side, has been invaluable.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, today you work for Vice President Kamala Harris, who herself is, as you mentioned, a prosecutor and attorney, and you are also a woman of color in the legal field. What has your experience been with respect to your identity and how it's impacted you and your career trajectory all these years?
I think it's really hard to divorce different parts of my identity when I think about this question, because I grew up as a South Asian woman in the South. I grew up with a father who was a professor, a single income family household, a person who kind of had this culture shock when I went to New England for college and law school. And so these different parts of my identity, I think, are inextricable. But I think similar to what we had talked about before, you may be the first, but you're not the last. I have really tried to center a lot of my practice and my time and energy on helping pre-law students or lawyers who are interested in public service, to give them like a branch to hang on to and to just give some non-judgmental advice or deliberation or just be an open ear. So that's impacted, I think, my extra legal work. I think the other thing is, and maybe this has kind of been a thread among my like seemingly disparate experiences doing a range of different things, from patent prosecution to the firm to this to judiciary stuff. It's just to maintain like I don't know the answer. I don't know what this area of law is, but I'm going to try to learn. I'm going to try to just put my best foot forward. And maybe it's just like this intellectual curiosity or like a humility about it. Like, I know I don't know. And so I'm going to try to learn and be open about when I don't know and reach out to people if I can get more information. And I think that that may have come from being a minority in North Carolina growing up and being a little nervous about saying, I do know something. So I think that's something I'm still working on, maybe the imposter syndrome of it, to feel more confident about when I feel like I do have the answer.
Yeah. As you just mentioned, you've worked across a range of what a legal career can look like, from big law to the U.S. military to now Associate Counsel to the Vice President of the United States. How have these diverse experiences shaped your perspective on the future of the legal field?
It's a really good question. I think that there are so many places in where society has outpaced the law. If you think about AI, if you think about just the advancement of tech generally, but also socially, the law was not built for people who are genderqueer, or even for a while, people of color or women. And we are seeing a real convergence of these issues. And I think it's going to require a lot of intellectual agility and intellectual humility to approach these matters. And the law firm model is an interesting one because there are smaller law firms that are, native to, there are Louisville law firms that handle more local issues. And then there are international law firms that handle things for large companies, but they charge a lot. Firms charge a lot of money. And why are they paying, why are they getting paid that money? It's to make sure that you have the most sound legal advice and the sharpest legal minds, because for better or worse, money draws talent, to work on these things. So I am excited to see how lawyers get more creative in their arguments and start using experts in different areas to better bolster their arguments, better bolster their briefs and understanding and counseling of issues. In the military too, I think drone policy or a lot of the national security threats and cyber threats that we're seeing today are not things that the JAG Corps had to face 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But again, it's going to require people to take a step back and think, okay, is this legal scheme the right scheme that we need to be using to solve this problem? Or does this require new legislation, new regulations? And the law is, as you know, is functionally backward looking, right? We use precedent. We use old cases to answer current problems. And I do think there will be a time where we have to be a little more bold about realizing what the limitations are as they sit.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing that thoughtful answer, because I think it has become a much bigger part of the conversation we're having today, given the pace of technology and just the problems we're facing, particularly over the past couple of years. It feels exponential. So I appreciate you sharing that. The last question I have for you today is, you have such an amazing, comprehensive career across law, particularly oriented towards this idea of service and public service. What advice do you have for aspiring young South Asian professionals and professionals broadly who want to pursue law with this public service bent and angle?
Yeah, I would say kind of just beating a dead horse, ask, raise your hand, send a cold email. I'm always a resource. You should find me. I truly believe in being able to be helpful, but also make your interests be known. I think there's a lot of nervousness about saying I want to go into government, because it is competitive and it is hard, and it is kind of hard to think about long term, right? I mean, I'm fully aware that my job is going to expire at some point, right? Because the administration will end. And so realizing that there is kind of this dance, you want to say that you're interested in government, but you don't look too ambitious. I think people should just say what they want to do and see how they can get the relevant experiences to make themselves competitive. The other thing is, I think it was Preet Bharara who, in a commencement address, I don't think it was my commencement address, but I remember listening to a speech on YouTube, that it's more important to be good than great, which I know is kind of disappointing because everyone's oh, I want to be great. But there's a lot of hard skills that you need to learn. You need to learn how to read a case. You need to learn how to digest what a ruling is. You need to understand what the specific problem that you're being asked to solve is. It's not going to help if you're asked about the dormant commerce clause. It's not going to help to be commerce is and just start vaguely on all your thoughts about commerce. You have to be very precise about answering the question at hand. And so it's important to maintain and develop those skills. And luckily, lawyers love to write books. And so there's a lot of books about being a good legal writer, about areas of law that you don't know. I frequently reread the explanatory manuals about different courses from law school that I still have in my house, just to make sure I get it. So that would be my suggestion. So one, send a cold email, ask for help, ask to hear what people's experiences are, especially for South Asians who don't have that many people maybe readily in their community. The people who I knew as lawyers were friends of friends' parents. They were people I had heard about who I'd not even really met for the most part. And then the second part is be open about what you want to do, so it helps people give you better advice. And the last is try to really just be good at what your job is and get what that is before you start looking at the next thing.
Yeah. Well, Medha, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us about your journey. I mean, it's truly a one-of-a-kind journey through the legal field, and to understand your passion for service is really inspiring, I have to say. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time. And of course, thank you for your service as well.
Oh, thank you, Simi. It's been a real privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you want to get new episodes straight to your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.